I really appreciate being here, and I want to recognize a couple of people. First, Danny, who I've known, and my wife Lee has known for probably 25 years, and Lord David Evans, who's sitting over there next to Lee, who has been very, very supportive of what we do, and we've been somewhat supportive of you, I don't know, a little bit. I just have to tell you, as I was walking in here, I said to my wife Lee, who's the CEO of America Works, our company, I said, in your wildest dreams, would you ever have expected that I'd be coming into London to the Policy Exchange and giving a talk? And she said, Peter, I hate to break it to you, but you've never been in my wildest dreams. She didn't really say that. I'm going to start, first of all, by telling you why I wrote a book that just came out about 3 months ago. And again, any of you that would like to get a copy of that book, let Dean know that, and I will send over copies. It's called Poor No More, and it follows my over 50 years working with poverty programs in the United States and being a little bit familiar with your experiences over here. I really came to the idea of the book when I had a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to go to Bellagio, Italy, and write about poverty. And believe me, the irony of writing about poverty and looking out on Lake Como from this beautiful palatial place was not lost on me. But what I came to as I thought about poverty in the United States was in 1965, I started working with the War on Poverty. It was called the War on Poverty, and it was a bill that was passed in Congress that President Johnson had proposed. President Kennedy had talked about doing that. And I went to work really as what I would call a foot soldier in that war. We all believed at the time that we were going to solve poverty in the United States, maybe within a decade, that the programs we put in place, that the commitment that people had to doing that would effectively change the society where we had such huge poverty to a society which pretty much got rid of it. Well, as I was sitting looking out on Lake Como, I went back and looked at what the poverty rate was in the United States when I started in 1965. And it was about 15.5%. And at the time I was writing the book a couple of years ago, it was 15.1%. And we had spent over $22 trillion, 22 trillion, not billion, $22 trillion to solve the problem. And we clearly had not moved the needle very far. And so I said to myself, what went wrong? I was part of it. It was kind of a mea culpa moment for me because I had believed so long that what we were doing worked. But it was clear maybe some of the programs worked, but the overall effort of bringing down poverty in the United States clearly had not worked. And I looked at this and I said, what could be done? How could we, in fact, change the nature of dealing with poverty in the United States? And I came up with a radical solution, which I'm going to tell you right now. And I consider it radical because, number one, it's never been proposed, and number two, it will be very hard to implement, but not impossible. The first is this, that welfare has become a real trap in the United States. That dependency has become a real trap, and that we should really basically get rid of all welfare, except for people who physically and mentally cannot go to work. And if they truly can't go to work, then there'll be a safety net for those people. Secondly, we get rid of all poverty programs in the United States because, as I just said a few minutes ago, $22 trillion didn't solve the problem. Why keep doing the same thing and expect a different outcome? And we take all that money, which is a huge amount of money, and we switch it over to creating jobs in the private sector, and if there aren't enough there, in the public sector, in public jobs. So that you'd say to somebody who had a baby and wants money from the government, no, but we have daycare and a job for you. Isn't that what we all want? Isn't it what we want? People to get a paycheck rather than a dependency check. And so that's what I was looking at. That's what I have been looking at. For me, it was a real change because I was very liberal, and in the United States, I mean really liberal. I came from a liberal Jewish family who believed in all kinds of things that I believed in. And I found myself, as the years went on, from the experience that Lee and I had, running programs, not from the ivory tower, not from a think tank, but from experience, that some of that was not correct. It wasn't working. And I really did change my views. There was maybe some of you know the name Mae West. She was a very famous comedian in the United States, kind of body. And she once said, I was pure as the new fallen snow, and then I drifted. And that was me. I drifted. I found myself moving almost imperceptibly from a very liberal position to a more conservative position. And let me explain what that meant. The liberal position in the United States, at least, has been that education and training are the way out of dependency. That you get people in a classroom, you give them the skills and the education necessary to move them from dependence into independence, and that they will become independent. But that never worked. And we watched that. Lee and I ran those kinds of programs. They didn't work. It wasn't because we didn't want them to work. It just didn't work because most of the people we were dealing with had been failed by the education and training systems in our country. And putting them again in another classroom just didn't seem to work very well. What we found was work first worked best. That if you moved a person into a job and then used the education and training to move them up in the job, that would be the best way of providing for independence for people. And it worked. Let me tell you how well it worked. When President, which one was it? What? Oh yeah, President Clinton. I'm sorry, I'm thinking of Johnson. I'm back in '65. When President Clinton had the desire to change welfare in the United States, he and Newt Gingrich, this was bipartisan, changed it so that work was the important strategy for reducing welfare dependency. Work first. And Lee and I spent our time dealing with the White House and saying, listen, education and training just hasn't worked. You've got to have work first. You've got to get people working. Well, that became part of the bill in the United States. And within 10 years, catch this, over 60% of the welfare rolls were reduced in the United States. People went to work. And it made such a difference. All the decades before, it was going up. But during that period of time, it all went down. We have found that significantly, if you say to people, you need to go to work and here's a job, and here we'll help you even get into that, that really is why people are willing to become part of our society in a way that's independent. A lot of people say, well, a lot of these people really don't want to work. They want to just take money and stay home. But you know, we at America Works, our company, we've placed over 1 million people in jobs around the United States. They've been ex-offenders, welfare recipients. They've been homeless vets. They've been people with disabilities, which has been a large program for us recently. And people want to work. You've got to give them the opportunity, give them the road toward that. But there's nothing wrong with education and training. And in some cases, education and training up front is not a bad idea. And we're doing some of that. Although that has to be done directly with companies, with the private sector, so that the jobs are there and you're training exactly for what they will be moving into. But having the opportunity to move into work is, to me, the most important. I have an op-ed that's coming out in the Wall Street Journal in the next few days. And in it, I talk about the fact that in the United States, I don't know if this has been part of the op-eds and dialogue, but there's a lot of talk about we don't have enough workers because the unemployment rate's so low. And my op-ed basically contends that the problem is not workers, it's working, that we don't have enough people working, that too many people are dependent on the government for basically staying home, many of whom shouldn't be. And many of whom actually don't want to be. And then we have a lot of young people who are on parent support, who spend a lot of time not working and not having to work. And so this is a very large group of people, and in the United States, we have the lowest work participation rate in the last 30 years. People are not working, at least a large portion of people who should be and could be working. This, to me, is the major problem in the United States. I don't know about here, but it's a major problem. I want to talk just briefly, before Danny's going to ask me some questions, but I want to talk just briefly about your experience with welfare reform. We're pretty familiar with it. We followed it pretty closely. And what I would say is this. You started with a program about 10 or 15 years, about 10 years ago, I guess, that kind of copied what we had as a model, work first and all. But it essentially took government and gave it to the private sector and made private sector act like government, which was not entrepreneurial. And it had these huge corporations, international, that were given large amounts of money, weren't held really too accountable, and then they were subcontracting to small charities that many of whom didn't have the capability to do it, and also were not getting much money from these what they call prime contractors. After a few years, the government shut all that down because they thought, well, we don't think this is working, although some of it actually was, but they didn't think it was. And they've now come up with a new model. You have a new model, which is a medical model. The medical model basically says, let's look at all the problems these people have. Let's see all the disabilities and all the barriers that the people have, and let's set up programs so that we can then move those people into jobs. Big mistake. When you set up that kind of process, what you do is you trap people. And that's what's happened in the United States until we had welfare reform. You said, what are the disabilities? What are the barriers? You're better off saying, what are the capabilities? Where are the jobs? Get them into the jobs, and then let them experience, and when there's a problem, deal with it. The last thing I want to talk about quickly is America Works, our company. It was the first for-profit, not for-profit, first for-profit welfare-to-work company in the United States. We set it up in 1984. As I said, we placed over 1 million people. What we do is act pretty much like a temp agency, like Manpower or Kelly or whatever, only we give a lot of support once the person gets to the job. So what we're looking at is, what is your ability? Get them to the job, and then if something gets in the way, such as an abusive mate, or daycare, or not understanding the mores of the workplace, we are there to help them get through that if they're a good worker. To me, that is the best way. My wife Lee, the CEO, says once we place a person, that's when our job begins. And really that is. It isn't so much what a person doesn't know, it's them fitting into the workplace. And we've been very helpful in easing them through the issues that come up. I call it the static in their lives. And what we do is we put a protective cocoon around them and give them the opportunity to succeed within the workplace at the private company. We've been quite successful with that, and our retention rates of moving people into jobs has worked really significantly. With that, I'm going to let Danny ask me some questions.